Welcome everybody. My name is Cynthia Walker and I'm going to be speaking about wartime history today through the lens of local Kennebunk experiences. Every object in the museum's collection tells a story about how people who came before us lived their lives. Unfortunately, history continues to repeat itself in national and international wars between cultures and governments. Since the beginning of time, historians can count on a significant war every few decades. The local perspective on some of these wars are what we'll talk about today. We will in no way scratch the surface, but more like provide a preview of what you'll discover should you choose to dive into research here at the museum. The Brickstore Museum holds nearly 70,000 items related to town and regional history. And among that number are items that tell the story of local experiences during wartime, whether they be at home or away. So again, what you'll see today is more a formal slideshow of stories of war here, and then we'll share our next video linked at the end of this one, where we'll have a look live in collection storage to view some of the artifacts, and I can answer questions that are typed in the comment area. And thank you for being patient with us as we get more and more adept at filming lectures, and pretty soon we'll be able to hold them live. It's just that we are still learning ourselves, so I appreciate you coming along with us, and we look forward to interacting in the future. Whatever the context, these stories are entombed in the museum so that the community can learn about our previous experiences and use these shared histories to build a stronger future. As this weekend honors Memorial Day, any donations made through the museum's website today, which will be linked below, will be split between two of our museum founders' favorite veterans causes, the American Legion Post and the American Red Cross. So let's get started in our review. Understandably, the museum only has a few existing items from the Revolutionary War. Perhaps our most well-known story from the war came after it, when General Lafayette, a revolutionary hero from France, visited the town in 1825. To aid the United States' victory in the War for Independence, France sent troops, including the young 19-year-old Marquis de Lafayette, to fight along with the colonial militia against the British. Lafayette became a close friend of George Washington. In 1824, President James Monroe invited Lafayette, then aged 67 and the last living Major General of the American Revolution, to come to the United States as the nation's guest. Lafayette accepted the 13-month-long visit and made a triumphant national tour. He stopped in each of the 24 states at the time to receive the accolades of his former comrades and the American people. By the summer of 1825, Lafayette was well into his tour. He traveled to Boston to lay the cornerstone for the monument to commemorate the Battle of Bunker Hill. After making stops in New Hampshire, he continued to Maine. Lafayette's secretary noted in his journal that the anticipated stop in Kennebunk was to be a small town of about 2,500 people, noteworthy in the commercial activity of its port. Ringing bells and militia heralded the general's arrival shortly after 1 p.m. on Friday, June 24th. Arches of flags, flowers, and evergreens spanned Main Street to welcome the procession, and it is said that the men constructing William Lord's General Store, now the Brickstore Museum, hung out the second-story windows to cheer Lafayette as he passed. Because of Lafayette's short stop at the Storer Mansion, still standing on Storer Street downtown, a large American elm tree was named after him, the Lafayette elm, which is here in this picture, and it grew in Lafayette Park next to the Storer Mansion. The tree was featured in the town's seal, actually it still is, and no doubt each of you can probably think of a landmark or a street or a building with the name Lafayette in it today. The Revolution certainly made a big impression here in Kennebunk. The American Civil War was fought from 1861 through 1865. Of the 628,279 people that inhabited Maine in 1861, almost half were under the age of 21. At the outbreak of the war, Maine answered Lincoln's call for volunteers. More than 24 men from Maine served in the Union Army as generals. Overall, Maine contributed 72,945 men to the war effort, which was a larger number of combatants in proportion to population than any other Union state. That's equal to 11% of Maine's citizens at the time, and also equals about a quarter of the entire male population of the state at the time in 1861. Of that, 9,398 men died in that service, and it's estimated that over 11,000 were disabled by wounds or disease. In early 1861, Andrew Walker, who owned a store here in Kennebunk, worried that businesses selling goods connected to the South would fail if the war lasted for more than 3 months. Indeed, it lasted for 4 years. By the end of 1863, prices of goods rose so steeply that the price of cotton advanced nearly 400%. William Chase, a Kennebunk man that lived in Virginia as a school teacher, returned to Kennebunk after the declaration of war. Virginia had notified him that if he did not leave within 12 hours, he would be forced to join the Confederate Army. Joseph Tickham, owner of the brig Zenith, learned that his ship was stuck in Florida due to the death of its captain. Upon sending Captain Barker to retrieve the ship from the South, Tickham expected they would sail for home. Neither Captain Barker nor the brig Zenith was ever seen again. In April 1861, Irish-born Jerry Kelly lived here in Kennebunkport and enlisted as a soldier and traveled south. After he left, the village heard quite a number of reports of his death. Upon hearing the reports of his own death, Kelly wrote to his wife, "If you hear again that I am dead, do not believe it until you hear it from me." Men from Kennebunk and York County mainly entered 4 regiments in the war: the 1st Maine Cavalry, the 8th, 27th, and 32nd Maine Regiments, and then of course several others joined the Navy. We'll take a look at these four regiments a little bit closely. The 1st Maine Cavalry was organized at Augusta, Maine, where men mustered in on October 31st, 1861, for 3 years. This regiment, including several men from Kennebunk, saw more men killed in battle than any other cavalry regiment in the Army. 15 officers and 159 enlisted men were killed and mortally wounded. 3 officers and 341 enlisted men died of disease, for a total of 518. After skirmishes in Maryland, the cavalry fought at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the war. Nearly 700 horses were lost in action or worn out in service by the end of 1862. Kennebunk native Joseph Hill, who previously acted as the Kennebunk Town Recruitment Officer, was captured with others in his company. As he sat in the prisoner transport wagon, Hill rummaged through the items in the wagon and he found a revolver. He immediately shot the Confederate guard, recaptured his horse and those of his unit, and led them back behind Union lines. The 8th Maine Regiment left the state on September 10, 1861. Several family pairs joined this regiment, like father and son Charles and Charles H. Nason, brothers Jesse and Charles Webster, and Plummer Adjutant, son of the 27th Regiment's George Adjutant. So it was really a family affair. On March 26th, while home on furlough, Kennebunk soldier Alva Rideout spoke to Andrew Walker about the state of the war, saying, "When I enlisted from patriotic motive, as did many others, but now patriotism is all played out. Now a soldier out south would be laughed at if he should say he enlisted from patriotism. That day has gone by." Upon his return to the front lines with the 8th Regiment, Alva Rideout was reported missing after a skirmish in Petersburg. He died at Florence, South Carolina prison on November 15th, 1864. In less than a year, the 8th Maine Regiment saw so many men killed that it won its place in a list called the 300 Fighting Regiments, which is a list of those who sustained the heaviest losses in battle. For example, at Drury's Bluff, the 8th Regiment lost almost a quarter of the men engaged. 4 days later, a detachment of 190 men suffered 83 casualties. At Cold Harbor, the regiment lost nearly a third. Veterans of the regiment mustered out in September 1864. The 27th Maine, in its majority, was made up of mostly York County volunteers. And as a train moved the troops south, they were met with celebrations throughout the East Coast. And 25 hours after leaving Portland, the troops set up their tents to the east of Washington, D.C.'s Capitol Hill. James Stone, who's pictured here, he was from Kennebunk, and he was chosen as major. York County had originally requested that the captain of said regiment would also be a Kennebunk man, quote unquote, and Seth Bryant of this town was selected as captain. The men waited to receive notice of their release as their 9 months of service came to a close without much action. They were still there in Washington, D.C. Suddenly, new orders assigned the 27th Regiment to the Army of the Potomac to join the northward march to Gettysburg. As soon as the promise of battle came, though, the orders were countermanded, and on the eve of their march to Pennsylvania, the regiment returned to Arlington for transportation home and discharge from the service. Yet the Battle of Gettysburg still loomed, and the capital lacked troops for its defense. So President Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton appealed to both the 25th and the 27th Maine regiments to remain in the city, and promised medals of honor to all those that, after the expiration of their term, would remain to protect the government in the present emergency. The 25th Regiment opted to leave immediately. The 27th Regiment, however, discussed it a little bit further. Arguments erupted between those who wanted to stay and others concerned for their families and the oncoming arrival of the haying season in Maine. The men stood in line, and those who chose to stay stepped forward. Captain Seth Bryant noted 311 men chose to re-enlist. Secretary Stanton, thankful for the assistance during the crisis, assigned medals of honor to these men. A mistake in the processing of the awards sent the medals to all the men in the 27th Maine, not just those who re-enlisted. By 1917, a War Department board reviewed every medal awarded to ensure consistency in its criteria. This resulted in something called the Purge of 1917, which over 900 medals were struck from the official record, including those of the 27th Regiment. This enabled the Department of War to elevate the medal to the position it holds today. Unsurprisingly, very few of the medals were returned to the government. The museum has several 27th Maine Medals of Honor in our collection, and in our next video we'll be showing you one of those. If anyone's interested in reading a little bit more about the 27th Maine, author John Pullen wrote a book called A Shower of Stars, The Medal of Honor and the 27th Maine, which is available wherever you buy books and of course in the library. The last local regiment that we'll look at is the 32nd Maine Regiment. It was the last fully organized regiment of the infantry raised in Maine during the war and was recruited in early March 1864. It was hurriedly recruited with 6 of the companies already leaving to war before the others were even raised. The infantry was immediately placed on active duty and went under fire in less than 3 weeks after leaving home. Taking part at the disaster of the mine, it lost at least 102 men out of 150 engaged. Kennebunk received news of the deaths of some of their own citizens, including Charles Hubbard, John Clough, and Isaiah Upson, who all died in the battle. As Lieutenant Silas Perkins of Kennebunkport lay in his tent, he was shot in the foot by the accidental discharge of a gun. Perkins was sent back to Maine due to his injuries. But when he arrived in Boston, the smell of the wound was so offensive that he traveled in a small train car the rest of the way by himself. After arriving in Kennebunk, he lived for 6 days before dying of his wounds at the age of 23. By December 1864, the regiment had sustained such heavy losses through battle and disease in the first months of fighting that it was amalgamated with the 31st Maine Regiment. Even the regiment's surgeon, Dr. Clark Trafton of Kennebunk, died of typhoid fever on August 11, 1864. So, of course, being a coastal town, many Kennebunk men enlisted in the Navy, including Joseph Brown, Greenleaf Hutchins, and Edward Thompson. They served in a variety of capacities and, of course, rose through the ranks to become officers. In addition to furnishing men for naval warfare, Kennebunk also supplied a ship, and that's the picture that you can see here. The gunboat Aroostook was built by Captain Nathaniel Lord Thompson's yard and launched November 7, 1861 in Kennebunk Port. A large number of people assembled to watch the ship begin its journey. It participated in the Battle of Hampton Roads, the taking of the James River, Drury's Bluff, and the 7 Days Campaign. The Aroostook was decommissioned in New York in September 1865 after the end of the war. Now, there are so many stories of over 200 men from Kennebunk that joined the war, but we'll just pick a couple. First, we'll talk about Seth Bryant. Before joining the war, Seth Bryant was deputy collector of the custom house in this town. He became captain of Company I in the 27th Regiment for 9 months of service. As most 27th Maine members did, he re-enlisted to remain in Washington, D.C., therefore earned the Medal of Honor. And after returning home from his service, he re-enlisted in 1864 as captain in the 32nd Maine. He was forced to resign after 7 months due to injury. The museum has his war diary, in which we find entries like this. In February 1863, he wrote, "We went through some of the wards where they were dressing the wounds, and they looked bad to me. One poor fellow was having his leg taken off as we passed. He was groaning dreadfully, and the blood was running in streams on the floor. If a person wishes to get an idea of war, let him go over to one of these hospitals after a battle, and he will see sights he never dreamed before." Next up is Horace Burbank. Much like Seth Bryant, Horace mustered into the 27th Maine in 1862. He too re-enlisted to remain in Washington and earn the Medal of Honor. He mustered out in 1863 after being promoted to full quartermaster sergeant. He then re-enlisted, as Seth Bryant did, as captain in the 32nd Maine. During the Battle of the Crater, he was taken prisoner and sent to Richmond jail. During his time there, he kept a diary, narrating his daily experiences of prison life. After 6 months of imprisonment, Burbank and several other officers and enlisted men escaped their captors and returned to fight with the Union Army as Sherman marched through Georgia. You can read all about Horace's experiences in Richmond jail with the Brickstore Museum's ebook, which is called The Diary of Horace Burbank, which you can find, of course, on Amazon or on the museum's website. Next is a man named Philip Lynch. His story is still a hidden one, and there's very little documented about him and his service, but I felt it necessary to highlight what we know about him, as he was the only individual to remain in the United States military after the war ended. Philip enlisted in the Navy in the spring of 1865 as the war was winding down. He was a free black man who lived with the Waterhouse family here in Kennebunk when he was a young man. And he served on a ship called the Vandalia. As of 1870, he was still in the naval service. So if anybody can find any information on him, please get in touch with us at the museum. William Simons is an interesting guy. He's one of my favorite people at the museum, or in Kennebunk history, I should say. Though he was drafted in 1863, he paid the commutation fee of $300 to stay home. A year later, though, at age 32, he was commissioned ensign in the Navy and then became sailing master of the gunboat Pinola in 1864. He wrote in his journal, And so I left the things of the past and commenced on a new system called red tape. I think we can all commiserate with that. His journal provides quite a few quips on the war, including an incident he witnessed while on board the Pinola. Outside, the Pembina and Sebago were blazing away with an insane idea that they could throw shot 5 miles. The little boat Philippi, too, got bewildered and must have run amok. Over the side went commander and men. He was forced to resign his post on account of ill health in 1865. After returning from the war, he became a well-known ship captain, sailing for several of the local ship owners here in town. He and his wife and their only child, Susan Smart Simons, were lost in October 1874 in the British Channel. Their ship collided with another, and all were lost. Lastly, we take a look at the Whitten brothers. Brothers Seth and Charles Whitten never returned home after their service. Charles mustered in the 12th Maine Regiment in 1865, near the end of the war, and he was last seen making his way home, but in New York City, he died of chronic diarrhea at the age of 17. His brother didn't fare much better, but took a more circuitous route. Seth Whitten originally mustered into the 5th Maine Regiment in 1861, then deserted a month later. After escaping home to Kennebunk, he apparently had a change of heart and re-enlisted in the 8th New Hampshire Regiment 4 months later, under the name John P. Hill. In August 1862, he died of fever in New Orleans at age 19. World War I saw 53,000 Americans die in battle, and it's bookended by the Civil War and World War II. Comparatively, not much is known about the war in the middle, at least not the amount of detail widely understood about the Civil War and the Second World War. By the time veterans were ready to share their horrific war experiences, World War II began, and the rest was swallowed by history. Up until 1917, the United States had never fought in a war beyond its own North American continent. Woodrow Wilson continued to push the idea that America was the world's last great hope. "We are at peace with the world," he said in December 1914. However, the United States and Wilson became increasingly uncomfortable with Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare as the war went on. The United States declared war in 1917. There are many instances of men and women joining the war effort before the United States declared war on Germany. In Kennebunk alone, 4 men joined the Canadian Expeditionary Forces prior to 1917. 3 of the men were naturalized citizens from Great Britain, so had a personal stake in the fight. Clement Ingham, age 30, Ernest Tomlinson, who was 35, and his brother Harry Tomlinson, who was 19, all left in early 1917 to join Canada. Warren Montgomery, who was 39, was born in Kennebunk, but he also joined the Canadian Forces. The Tomlinson brothers, Ernest served with his brother Harry in the 13th Battalion of the Canadian Royal Highland Corps. He was killed in action in 1918 and is buried in the British cemetery at Pas-de-Calais, France. His younger brother Harry returned to Kennebunk after the war and lived at 14 Fletcher Street. The state of Maine sent more than 35,000 men and women to war in 1917. The state also supplied the U.S. and its allies with ships via Bath Iron Works and Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and food and materials through its 2 largest industries, farming and manufacturing. So if you just picture it, in Kennebunk, even the main roads were still made of dirt in 1917. Most buildings were made of wood. And one of our most picturesque buildings, the mill building at the corner of Stores and Main Streets, would soon be completed in 1918. It now houses Duffy's Tavern and Grill, among many other great folks. For families in Kennebunk and throughout the nation, this was just 1 or 2 generations removed from the Civil War 55 years prior. Local families like the Clarks, the Butlins, and the Junkins, as well as the Huffs, all sent multiple male relatives both to the Civil War and the Great War. According to Kennebunk's American Legion post, the town of Kennebunk sent more men to serve during World War I per capita than any other Maine town. In all, 160 men left for war from Kennebunk, which had a total population of 3,050 people at the time. Unlike the preceding Civil War, local soldiers were not always placed in the same regiments, which were organized and reorganized several times before even making it to the front. But in the case of the 54th Regiment, several Kennebunkers found themselves in a friendly group. According to Kennebunk soldier George Eaton, this regiment was made up of men transferred from all other units, and in all, 14 Kennebunk men ended up serving the regiment together throughout the entire war. Other Kennebunkers served, including author Kenneth Roberts, Dean Brigham, who was second lieutenant in the 303 Tank Corps, George Dround, who was an aircraft mechanic in the anti-aircraft sector, and men like Earl Hanscom, Charles Hicks, Richard Mitchell, Calvin Waterhouse, and Harold Weber, who all fought at the Meuse-Argonne, or the Argonne Forest, one of the bloodiest battles in the war. Charles Goodnow, who is in this picture, and I'm sorry, it skipped ahead and I just noticed it, so I put it back. So Charles Goodnow, who's at the left in our slide, he was from Kennebunk and enrolled in the U.S. Naval Reserve in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1917. He attended a naval aviation school at MIT in early 1918 and was soon working at the Naval Reserve Flying Corps in Washington, D.C. He was sent to serve at the U.S. Naval Air Station at Killingholme, England until early 1919. And during his time in service, he got tattoos on both of his arms and moved back to Kennebunk and lived at a place that is still standing at 34 Summer Street. He was a well-liked businessman and later became president of Kennebunk Savings Bank. The museum's lucky to have soldiers' diaries and letters in our archives, including one written by a man named Cecil Clark of Kennebunk. And here's what he wrote. I have it up on the screen as well. April 19th, 1918. Dear folks, well, here we are in what they call sunny France, but have only seen about 2 days of sunshine since we landed in Europe. Fog and rain caused, they say, by heavy firing of big guns. The number of flying machines would make a flock of English sparrows look small. All around is the tramp of feet and all kinds of uniforms and faces. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, also known as the Battle of the Argonne Forest, was a major part of the final Allied offensive that stretched along the entire Western Front. The battle was fought from September 26, 1918, until the armistice on November 11, 1918, for a total of 47 days. This offensive was the largest in United States military history, involving 1.2 million American soldiers, including many men from the Kennebunks like Sidney Batchelder, Warren Brown, Earl Hanscom, Calvin Waterhouse, and Richard Mitchell. Both Harold Weber and Charles Hicks of this town were killed in the battle, which cost a total of 26,277 American lives. And that made it the largest and bloodiest operation of World War I, and the second deadliest battle in American history, second only to the Battle of Normandy in World War II. In the Second World War, nearly 40% of U.S. servicemen and women volunteered for military service, while the other 60% were drafted. Nearly 80,000 Mainers served in the war, more than any other previous war. Over 2,000 Maine soldiers died in service to their country, including 206 men from York County alone. Kennebunk prepared for war like many other towns that crossed the nation did. They were active as air raid observers. Observation stations stood at what is now the I-95 overpass at Cap Musson Road, and the other atop the Pythian Block building on Main Street. Beach patrols on the town's beaches saw citizens watching for enemy approach by water. The U.S. government formed several oversight organizations to help educate and organize civilians during the war, especially regarding food, conservation, and rationing. The War Ration Board was established in 1942 in every town, including Kennebunk, and Kennebunk native George Wentworth managed the rationing board here in York County. If you're interested in hearing more about the history of the home front and victory gardens in World War II, we have a recorded lecture on our Digital Learning Center on our website that focuses on those efforts during the war. The average height and weight for a male entering the military during World War II was 5'7", 145 pounds. As teenagers and children growing up in the 1930s, those enlisting had survived food shortages of the Great Depression, only then to have to go to war. During World War II, there were some 20 million eligible young men in the selective service, and at least 40% were rejected the first year of the draft on the basis of poor nutrition. I'll just note that there was a journal entry from someone we have kept in the archives. From August 14, 1945, the news of Japan's surrender reached Kennebunk, and within minutes of the radio announcement, Main Street was filled with jubilant crowds for over 2 hours. It was estimated by the Kennebunk Star that over 2,000 people took part in the celebration. Church bells rang, fire sirens went off, and cars were decorated. At 9 p.m., there was a service at the Baptist Church, drawing about 100 attendees. Now you can see up on the screen now I have our contact information, and that's because we're always actively looking for local stories of service during World War II, as well as the Korean War. If you go on our website right now, we are starting an oral history page, which currently has our interview with local World War II veteran James Pastorelli. So if you go to the archives portion of our website, you'll be able to listen to his interview and his experiences right there. A few names that we have and that we know include Timothy Mart, who served from 1941 to 45 in the 8th Coast Artillery, Natalie Park, who served as Lieutenant Commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve from 1942 to 46, and Neil Cate, who served from 1942 to 45 on the USS Merrimack. Again, if you know of a local story, please share it with the museum by emailing us at info@brickstoremuseum.org. This is a great picture from the 1947 Memorial Day Parade that we have borrowed from the American Legion Post 74, so we thank them for that. And I'll just say you might notice that soldiers of World War I and the Civil War have memorial lists here in town. The town had a similar honor roll for World War II veterans, but it was made of wood and eventually was taken down. The park at the corner of Summer Street and Route 1, though, has a memorial stone for those who served during the war. The last war we're going to look at is the Vietnam War. U.S. involvement in Vietnam began in the 1950s. And by the end of 1967, American troops in Vietnam approached 500,000. And U.S. casualties reached 15,058 killed and 109,527 wounded. At that point, only 35% of Americans supported U.S. policies in Vietnam. American troop strength in Vietnam peaked in 1968 at 540,000. And as the war drew on, deterioration amongst American soldiers increased. Upon returning home, soldiers experienced retaliation and disrespect, to say the very least, from those who disagreed with the war in general. Their anger was misdirected towards soldiers. At the end of January 1968, U.S. Army General Westmoreland requested 200,000 more troops, despite repeated assurances that victory in Vietnam was imminent. After the Tet Offensive on January 31st, Americans realized it would be a long fight. Support for the war sank even further. When it was done, the Vietnam War cost the United States 58,220 lives. Maine lost 350 men in the war. Kennebunkport sent over 350 men and women to the war and saw 3 men die in battle. Killed in action were Thomas Wayne Bazemore. He was born December 12, 1947. He was 22 years old. He was drafted into the Army with the start of his tour on May 20th, 1969, in the 101st Airborne Division, 501st Infantry. He was killed by an explosive device in the Quang Tri province in South Vietnam. on August 20th, 1969, exactly 3 months after his tour began. He is memorialized on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. Robert Lester Berry was born July 31st, 1949. He was 19 years old. He enlisted in the Army and started his tour December 1st, 1967, as an aircraft material supply specialist. He served with the 1st Aviation Brigade, 164th Aviation Group, 221st Aviation Company. He died from non-hostile action in Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam, on March 18th, 1968. He is buried at Pine Grove Cemetery in West Kennebunk and is also memorialized on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. Terry Francis Drown was born October 24th, 1944. He was 25 years old. He was drafted into the Army, started his tour February 10th, 1969 as Specialist 4 Light Weapons Infantry. He served with the 11th Light Infantry Brigade, 4th Battalion, 21st Infantry. He was killed by an explosive device in Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam on June 11th, 1969. He too is memorialized on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. Fear of the draft system caused many men to volunteer for the armed forces in order to have more of a choice in what military branch they would serve. If drafted, men were not given the choice of military branch, and often drafted men went straight to the infantry on the front lines. With 2.7 million American soldiers sent to the Vietnam War in total, about 2/3 of the men volunteered. Out of that total, 1 out of every 10 American soldiers was injured or killed during the war. Once again, I'll put up a plea here. If you are, or someone you know, is a Vietnam War veteran, we're looking for your stories to keep and preserve for the next generations. So please contact me at cwalker@brickstarmuseum.org, or of course our phone number at 207-985-4802. If you'd be willing to share your story in any way you feel comfortable. Additionally, for those listening in that are military veterans or active duty personnel that can share your stories of modern warfare, please consider this an invitation to you as well. Before we go, I wanted to highlight the story of the Weber-Lafay American Legion Post 74 here in Kennebunk. It opened in 1919 to support veterans of all wars. The post has was the new Veterans Care Organization in town after the closing of the GAR, which stands for the Grand Army of the Republic, organization that formerly supported veterans of the Civil War. Today, Post 74 is titled the Weber-Lafay Post. It's named after the first Kennebunk soldier to die in World War I, Harold Weber, and the first Kennebunk soldier to die in World War II, Edward Lafay. Initially, the Legion met in the town hall. After World War II, a woman named Nellie Parsons donated her home on High Street to be used as the new Legion home. And that was dedicated in 1946. And then later in the 1970s, the Legion moved to its current home on Water Street. I want to thank the Legion for all of the community work it continues to do. And I also want to really highlight that all of us should take a moment to thank those who gave their lives in service to this nation. The preservation of human experiences are incredibly important to the future. If you or your family has artifacts or a story of your ancestors relating to wartime, past, present, or future, I invite you to visit us at the Brickstar Museum to ensure those histories are saved. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you to all who have served and continue to serve. So right now we're going to close out this portion of our lecture, and the next video up is going to be a live visit to the Brickstar Museum's collection, so we can take a look at some of the wartime memorabilia and artifacts that we have here in the collection. So we will see you right over at that video.